Well, this involves the church and it involves the state. And these two things at some point come into tension with one another, and the course of history in the Latin West will be altered by this tension. We've talked about the introduction of perspectival space and the conception of the ideal city, this illusion of three-dimensional depth which can be plotted onto a two-dimensional surface. It's easier to paint it on a two-dimensional surface. The next easiest thing to do is to work it out in the villas of a wealthy patron. The most difficult thing to do is to actually construct it, and that's what we've been seeing slowly over a couple of hundred years happening in Florence with the realignment of streets, the construction of things that would be terminated by a particularly important view of something, and so on. Now, there's a political background to this, and before we wax too poetic about, gosh, wouldn't the world be better if we had more sort of public space like the Piazza della Signoria, I want to caution you that you might not actually have liked this world all that much, and that it was, as I've said several times, not about having cups of cappuccino with your husband or your wife, or sitting around at my age talking about your grandchildren, what you want to do on your summer vacation. This is the burning of Savonarola, who was a heretic monk who was burned in the Piazza della Signoria in public. We'll come to it later, but just to point out that in the Place de la Concorde in Paris, almost 2,000 people lost their heads in public over a 2-year period. You can do the arithmetic. It's over 2 per day in public over a 2-year period. Every day. Going to the beheading today? Nah, I've got class. So this is a kind of authority that thankfully, at least in the world we live in here, has by and large vanished, but which was very much present in these places. Giordano Bruno, who I've already discussed actually briefly. He was a follower of the philosopher Epicurus, a follower of Lucretius, the Roman poet, who was a follower of Epicurus. His teachings did not square with the canonical teachings of the Roman Church, and he was burned at the stake on the spot where his statue now stands in the Campo dei Fiori in Rome. Now, during this time, there is tension which begins to develop not only between science and sort of traditional forms of authority like the church, but also between these guilds and the church, between the guilds and the wealthy landowners who had sort of grown up out of the Middle Ages. This tension ultimately results, it's not a regular history course, so we won't get into the complexities of the Reformation, but it is significant, I think, in that Italy in the 15th century was not simply the center of, Florence is about right here, the center of artistic production. It was also the center of scientific investigation, scientific discovery. If you go to the Museum of the Story of Science, which is on the back side of the Uffizi, it's sort of funny because you go and there are all these beautiful paintings in the Uffizi, and there's a line from about here to across the freeway waiting to get into the Uffizi to see the paintings. But this Museum of the Story of Science, which is actually contained in the same building, has nobody in it. And there was a professor I ran into there from the University of Minnesota, a math professor, and he was just incensed that no one was in this Museum of Science. And they were all over there looking at these paintings. And I said, don't you get it? You live in a world of live science and dead painting. All right? So people want to see these paintings because there's no way they can. Plus, they've heard about them their whole lives. So they're willing to stand in line, pay a lot of money to go see these paintings. But seeing the telescope that Galileo used to discover the moons of Jupiter, or Michelangelo's drawing instruments, or the astrolabes that were used in early navigation is of no interest, right? So if you ever do get to Florence, I highly recommend going on the backside of the Uffizi to that museum, because in it you will see what I think were the most remarkable things, these early scientific instruments made of glass. Now glass had to be blown by hand, and there are early barometers in there that are as tall, they're maybe 48 inches tall, and they are as big around as a drinking straw in a coil. And you look at that and you say, how many of these things did they break before they got one? But the real question is, how did they calibrate it? How did they calibrate these instruments? I don't have an answer for that. That puzzles me, something I hope in my retirement I'll be able to answer. Well, the reason I'm mentioning this is that the effect of the Reformation in the North, wresting away control of the authority of the church from the papacy, from the Pope, also became a refuge for a lot of scientists who were either excommunicated, as in the case of Galileo much later, but they all began to move north. So Copernicus, right, is operating up here in Poland, but who is his client? Who is paying to build his laboratory, his observatory? Does anyone know? The Pope. That's why he couldn't publish his discovery that the earth was not at the center of the universe. It wasn't simply because he was afraid he was going to be like Savonarola. It was that it actually would have contradicted what he was being paid for by his client. All right, so it was published after his death. Now, what was the Pope trying to do? Well, one of the things they wanted to do was standardize time. Because if you could standardize time and you could regulate all your religious holidays and festivals, today we take this for granted that I can, 11 o'clock, show up and most of the class will be here. And some of the class will be here, you will be here, and you have some assumption when you woke up this morning that I would be here, right? But that is a fairly recent thing. That was not the case at this point in time. So the church, the Roman church, was obsessed with trying to standardize time. And thus they were paying Copernicus along with others, Tycho Brahe and others. But all that activity is occurring up here. And so if we look at where the sort of center of nascent industry based on sort of science is in the 15th century, it's here. If we fast forward 200 years, it's all moved north to Germany, the Netherlands, and England. Some in France. But that's significant because it alters substantially. This break with the church was not simply a splitting it up into various denominations. Reminds me of an old joke about the difference between the first Ponce de Leon Baptist Church and the second Ponce de Leon Baptist Church. And somebody said, what's the difference? So, well, the first Ponce de Leon Baptist Church, they say that Pharaoh's daughter found Moses in the bulrushes. And the second Ponce de Leon Baptist Church says that she said she found him in the bulrushes. That's a little joke, but it carries with it a certain point, and that is that all these various denominations then split up and have different rules and different sets of beliefs. Calvin believes in this, and works versus faith, and all this kind of stuff. But in the greater geopolitical sense, it pushes the scientific revolution away from the Mediterranean and into the north. Okay, and that's a pretty profound thing. So just a map of this, looking then at the Holy Roman Empire, which was actually Spanish, and a war had broken out between the papacy and the emperor, Charles V. And the Holy Roman Empire was not in Rome, nor was it holy. It was mostly German, including most of Spain, and then all of southern Italy, including Sicily. This is part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire that we see here in the Kingdom of Hungary. By the way, the Swiss Confederation kind of grew up out of all of this, but so it kind of pushes this stuff, as I said, to the north, and war has broken out. And ultimately, I get these calls, these robocalls from people during political year. They want to know if I'm a Democrat or a Republican, and I say, well, I'm an independent. I've voted for Democrats if I think that appeals to me. I think they're the best person. I'll vote Republican if I think they're the best person. I don't have a third choice. I have to somehow declare, right? And when you go in the voting booth, you sort of have to come down to declare A or B. And so a lot of people who were in these sort of early republics, Savoy, Milan, Venice, up here in Florence and so forth, ultimately had to declare allegiance to the emperor or allegiance to the papacy. And one party became known as the Ghibellines, and the other party became known as the Guelphs. And that will become important in just a moment. So, the Roman Church couldn't sit idly by and just let all of this happen, right? They're losing their congregations, they're losing their authority, they're losing money, they're losing all kinds of things. And so they convened a huge council of Trent in Trento, and it met for the better part of the 1500s. And if you think Congress was dysfunctional, you should read about this. They couldn't agree on much of anything. It took them 35 years to come up with these 5 things. This is referred to as the Counter-Reformation. In other words, what the papacy is doing to try to sort of somehow stem the flow or stem the tide of this Reformation that's occurring in the North. Now, why is that important for cities? Well, it's important because one of the things that they did two main things. One thing was they clamped down on heresies. That ran all the sciences to the north. The second thing that they did was they tried to make the church more open and more accessible and more theatrical and appealing more to popular opinion. How would you do that? Right? How would you do that? You make it more theatrical, right? And so we will see then a Counter-Reformation Pope, Pope Sixtus V, creating a plan for the reconstitution of Rome, which follows the lead of Florence and the Piazza Santissima Annunziata in actually sort of trying to create a unified field out of the entire city. So, 2 things. One is they're running all the scientists off to the north, right? Clamping down on heresies, burning people at the stake. And the second is they're trying to open the church up. Seems like they're sort of in opposition to one another, but they were reconciled in their minds. Well, Michelangelo is working in for the tombs on the tombs of the Medici, which he never finished, in Florence, and has taken refuge in the actual chapel, the Medici Chapel, in Florence, because war has broken out in Florence between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, between those loyal to the Pope and those that were loyal to the Emperor. In 1527, the army of the Emperor, although he was not involved, it was one of his lieutenants, sacked and burned Rome. And in 1535, the Pope and the Emperor had decided they were in fact going to come back together and sort of make a rapprochement, make a treaty in this fighting, in this war, so on and so on and so forth. So this is a big deal. We make a big deal in the news about whether Rouhani, the new Iranian president, and John Kerry would shake hands. And if so, would they shake like this, or would they do something else, or what? I mean, this, so you can imagine the stakes here are very, very high, right? For this rapprochement between the papacy and the emperor. And so Michelangelo was called out of Florence, where he's been taking refuge, actually working on these tombs in this chapel. And he is given the task of going up to the Capitoline Hill in the space of the asylum and to remake the city hall. This is in 1535. The red that you see is the outline of the classical period buildings. This one we're not sure of. This is the Arx, or the Citadel here. This is the Temple of Jupiter Capitolinus with the valley in between. And then the Tabularium, which was the library of the Roman Senate. This is the site of the Comitium, just for reference. This is what it looks like. If we superimposed the ancient buildings, Temple of Jupiter, the base that still remains of the 1st century BCE tabularium, the medieval City Hall of Rome. This building that you see here, which is a medieval building that was embedded here, called the Palazzo Conservatori, and then out of the picture to the top, behind that sort of L-shaped building, which Michelangelo built to create a mask for the side of this church called Santa Maria in Araceli, which covered over the site of the Temple of Juno Moneta. And then to create a piazza in the center with the sole survivor of this vast shipwreck, the last remaining equestrian statue known at the time from the ancient world. So I would urge you to download and to try to understand what's going on, because this is important. It will be on the test, but it's important because it changed architecture and it changed cities from this point forward. This is actually the medieval site. There we see the Palazzo Conservatori. There we see Santa Maria in Araceli on the site, probably of the Temple of Juno. And then here we see this medieval city hall in this rather bad space in between. The rapprochement between the Emperor Charles V and the Pope was to occur in the asylum, was to occur here in the ancient Capitoline Hill. They agreed to that, but it turned out that it was very embarrassing because it had rained and there was no way that they could actually get up the hill. And so the emperor fell off, his horse got bogged down in the mud and he fell down, and it was kind of a disaster. So what they wanted, what the Pope wanted, was then to remake a modern Rome, in a sense, out of this shambles of medieval buildings built on the sites of these classical buildings. So this is called the Campidoglio. Campidoglio. That's the old asylum, is the Campidoglio. The old Palazzo Senatore, we see at the top, the Palazzo dei Conservatori here, and the Palazzo Nuovo, which is inserted in between. So the first thing that Michelangelo does is to get the Pope to donate. Actually, he didn't want this. The Pope insisted on it. The last remaining equestrian statue from the Roman world. All those bronze statues have been melted down for cannonballs and belt buckles and everything else, right? There's only one statue left. It turns out it was a statue of Marcus Aurelius. Why did it survive? If they had known it was Marcus Aurelius, he would have been melted down. He would have been the first to go. Because they thought it was a statue of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. So the Pope had him preserve it, and it stood in front of San Giovanni Laterano, the cathedral church of Rome, for all this period, all the way from 300 AD all the way up to 1535. So Michelangelo designs a base for this equestrian statue, and he does an interesting thing. He turns it around. Now, the classical city, if you recall, was on this side of the Capitoline Hill, that way. He turns the statue around to face the Campo Marzio, where the medieval city had developed because of the absence of water supply, the absence of the aqueducts that could feed the hills and so forth. He then inscribes an oval, a perfect geometric figure, which then becomes the generative elements from which a new building on the left and a new facade on the Palazzo Senatore and a new facade on the Palazzo Conservatori would be added. This implies then a cross-axis, so he moves the bell tower, knocks the bell tower down, and moves it over so that it is on line on this axis that we see here, and then puts a thin plate across the front of the Palazzo Senatore, changing the entire appearance of the building. Although the body of the building remains medieval, there's about a 1 meter thick sort of facade that is added to this front part that we see here. And there's the equestrian statue at D. That's what it looked like at the time of Michelangelo's death. The statue is in place. We can see that the bell tower has not been moved, but now the door has been moved. The front door has been moved from here over to here with this staircase going up and a statue in the center. The oval, of course, remains at this point only on paper, but his successor, Giacomo della Porta, in fact, it's continued architects, the principal, the second man, and third man, continue to follow Michelangelo's lead as they move through the whole thing, ultimately resulting in the composition that you see on the right. And that is with the Palazzo Nuovo here, the new palazzo, which is constructed here to create a kind of mask for the side of this medieval building. The Cordata here, which is actually a stair ramp that allows you to get up to this piazza. The bell tower is now moved over. There's that sort of giant order that we see that Michelangelo is so well known for, that is actually all occurring in a space, really a couple of meters on the facade, on the front of that building. And then there we still see the medieval building embedded within the body, the fabric of the Palazzo Conservatori. But here it's actually a three-bay addition that Michelangelo added. What is the Palazzo Conservatori? Well, at this time, a lot of these wealthy people had been creating private art collections of classical works. The great sculptor in the 17th century, Bernini, would begin his career by adding, you would only have a torso. So you would need to put back an arm, a leg, a head. And a lot of these people, the Farneses, for example, Alessandro Farnese, who had become a pope, actually had his own portrait bust mounted on the bust of the bust of a Roman soldier. And it was that sort of thing, right? They're completing these broken up pieces. Then they would donate them here to the city of Rome. I love this museum. It's one of my favorites, the oldest museum in the world. There you see it, this sort of pink thing over here. But I love it because it really is just a collection of stuff. I mean, there's just everything in there. You know, it's like there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's like, you go to the Van Gogh Museum, what do you expect to see? Paintings by Van Gogh, right? You go here and there's a classical bust and a tapestry from something else and, the guy pulling the spine out of his foot. I mean, it's just a mishmash of everything known to man because of these people donating these pieces to this collection in the name of the city of Rome. For us, however, what's important is the extension of this axis outward. There we see a copy of the statue. It's an exact copy made with CAD/CAM technologies. I watched this being made over about a 4-year period. The original statue is in the Palazzo Conservatori. It was gilded. That means that it had gold attached to bronze. Gold is a base metal, right? It doesn't interact. Well, it will over a long period of time. There's an electrochemical reaction with bronze, and the statue was deteriorating, which was exacerbated by the presence of sulfur dioxide and acid rain in the atmosphere due to carbon emissions. And so to preserve the statue, they made an absolute duplicate of it using CAD/CAM technologies, moved the original statue in the palazzo, and then replaced it with this one. Michelangelo actually did the base. And there we see that composition. Now, the remarkable thing about this, how many statues of guys on horses have you seen in your life? Right? Quite a few, right? I mean, you go to Washington, D.C., or you go to Moscow, you go to St. Petersburg, go to Paris. There's always, go downtown, there's always a guy on a horse. Okay? Well, it all comes, all of those statues, the precedent for that is this statue. This statue. It's amazing. The statue of Marcus Aurelius. We'll see George Washington in Boston disguised as Marcus Aurelius, or Marcus Aurelius disguised as George Washington. Other statues, such as Castor and Pollux, were pieced back together. Roman milestones, fragments of things, are all sort of mounted up here. There we see Santa Maria in Araceli in the background. And then this old photograph I took in 1980, which is actually showing from the front door of the Palazzo Senatori, City Hall, then the implication of the extension of that axis out from the Palazzo Conservatori, pinching this down. Also, all you urban designers in here, I want you to notice this. All you architects, you notice this. This is actually a drainage system. Remember this in Construction Tech 2. This is the high point. Everything is draining here. It then splits at a 2% slope into slots, which are actually up under this kind of platform that all of this is actually resting on, sitting on. We are almost out of time, so let me just finish today's lecture with completing the Campidoglio. There we see then the horizon line. We see the axis extending out. We see the vanishing points as they move. And there we are. Those of you who are interested in this experience, I won't be there, but others, Thanos Economou, will be. It is a great experience. There are people in the room who've done this. It's a great learning experience. So we'll end with that, okay? You can contact me or you can go to this website. And we will pick up talking about then San Pietro and then the plan of Sixtus V, which created a unified field of the entire city of Rome, which would last not only in Rome, guiding the growth of that city for 300 years, but will influence every city in the Western world all the way up to Chicago in 1909, all the way into the 20th century.